1. Colors swirled and collapsed upon each other. Hot and cold wind blew across Hal's face from different directions. Before his disoriented mind could discern up from down, the ground rose up and smacked into his face. Luckily, the soft grass cushioned the fall. Hal wanted to lay there for a while longer. He wanted nothing more than to shut his eyes and will himself to wake up on his couch back in his studio apartment in Seattle. "This is just a bad dream," he told himself. "I'll wake up soon." But the reality, the truth of the situation, did not allow for such wishful thinking. It kicked down his flimsy barriers of denial in the form of a snorting, snuffling animal bumping into his hip. Hal opened his eyes and shouted in alarm at what he saw. A two-headed wild pig of some kind with a mohawk of spiny white hairs was investigating him. Hands pressed to the grassy ground, Hal pushed himself up to his feet. He turned to keep the beast in his line of sight and backed away slowly. The strange creature regarded Hal curiously, two pairs of eyes watching him with too much intelligence for his taste. A howling cry echoed somewhere to his left in the distance, and the pig creature squealed in fright. By the time Hal looked back in the creature's direction, it had kicked up a dusty trail and was in full retreat. "Okay, not a dream," Hal thought, coughing as the dust cloud blew over him on a gust of wind. "I don't think I've ever coughed or felt like I was choking a dream before." The howl sounded again. It had a discordant, ethereal quality that raised the hairs on the back of Hal's neck. He found himself putting one foot in front of the other in the opposite direction, glad he had collapsed on his couch fully clothed. He had been too tired to even remove his shoes. He was in some autumnal landscape. Brown, sere grass crunched underfoot. Hills covered in a riot of golds, oranges, and reds filled his vision. Copses of tall trees, oaks maybe, though he doubted he could tell most trees apart, dotted the hilly countryside. With no immediate destination in mind, Hal continued down the hill and into the sheltered valley. He climbed the next hill and felt a wave of relief when the howls sounded again but seemed farther away. This second hill was taller than the one he had woken up on. As he pressed through the saplings that sprouted between the thick trunks of the trees, he spotted a distant village. Not a city, nor a town, not even a suburb. A village. The kind you'd see on a quaint tour of Europe's rural countryside. Questions swirled in his addled mind. Everything still felt jumbled, and his mouth felt cottony. "There's nowhere near Seattle that looks like this that I know of. It's far too dry. Besides, there'd be 1,000 hikers snapping selfies to show their followers how outdoorsy they are." The only thing that reminded him of Seattle was the dreary sky. Dark storm clouds scudded across a gray, lifeless ceiling. What little sunlight shone through was muted and watery. Pieces of recent memories flitted back to him in sharp-edged fragments. They felt like something from a movie, only he knew, without a doubt, that it had been real. He knew, too, that this place was real. His dreams always had that fuzzy quality to them, but this was too mundane, too grounded. A chill wind knifed through his red flannel shirt as he ventured out from the relative quiet of the hilltop to descend to the village below. While cold, the brisk wind revitalized him. He pulled out his cracked cell phone, unlocked it, and tried to pull up his GPS. The screen glitched and flashed. When it came back, his Maps app was blank. Usually, if he was remotely near his apartment, it would still show him the general area. There was nothing. Hal cycled through several more apps, trying to see if anything worked. So long as it didn't require an internet connection, it did. Photos worked. His smiling face appeared next to strangers and friends alike. More strangers than friends, he had to admit. As he swiped through his pictures, he came across one that pulled him up short. It was a picture of the assassin. in a treehouse. And he wasn't alone. The tall man squatted on a small plastic stool and sipped from a tiny teacup, one pinky out. Across from him, looking perfectly pleased, was the most adorable little otter, also drinking from a teacup. Hal blinked and swiped to the next photo. There they were again. He swiped again and again. Each image was like a frame in a flipbook. As he swiped, they put down their cups, poured more hot tea, and continued sipping. After the 20th photo, the otter seemed to notice the camera. It hopped down from its seat and waddled toward the camera, then covered the lens with a paw. The next images were black. And then his normal photos resumed. Hal tried to swipe back to the dozens of photos that should not have been on his phone, but when he did, there was no trace of them. He put the phone away and tried to forget about the photos. He wasn't sure what was going on with him or where he was, but he needed to get moving. Standing still in the wilds, no matter where he was, wouldn't help him. No cell reception, no food or water. The air smells weird. Everything seems off about this place. And there's a village ahead. Oh, and yeah, I saw some crazy assassin murder some baby-faced guy who looked like he was cosplaying as a Greek god. He pinched the bridge of his nose and forced himself to take a deep breath. The village ahead was nestled between two of the larger hills in the distance. As he made his descent, he could keep it in sight as long as he took a slanting path to his left. Try as he might, Hal was having trouble remembering precisely what happened in that large room. He had smacked into the hard marble floor of the place in much the same way as he arrived here, but the rest of it was all jumbled with fear, pain, and haze. The image of the assassin stood out clear in his mind, though. The jean jacket, red hoodie, red sneakers, and fingerless gloves were hard to forget. But for the life of him, he could not remember the face. There were only glowing eyes that strangely reminded him of old TV scan lines under that hood. Hal had the strangest feeling like the assassin wanted to help him, though he couldn't imagine how. It was another mystery he hoped to solve in the town below. As the town grew closer, more of the strange meeting began to unravel. The assassin used Babyface's dead arm to brand him. He clearly remembered the savage pain, though his left forearm felt perfectly fine now. Pulling his sleeve up, Hal's breath hitched in his throat. He had a glowing tattoo. It was astonishingly intricate. He was so consumed with the mark on his otherwise unblemished skin that he nearly ran right into a boulder as big as a horse. When he poked the skin, it felt as normal as any other part of his body. The only difference was the glowing, golden ink. It caught the pale light of the midday sun filtering through the thick cloud cover and reflected it in a gilded shimmer. The tattoo was a series of triangles with intricately inscribed lines within each shape. It resembled a 20-sided die, a D20. Except it was flattened and spread out. Without the strangeness of the assassin and Babyface, he might have been able to believe that he got drunk, and so inebriated got a tattoo of the Triforce he always secretly wanted, but never dared to follow through on. The 6 extra right-angle triangles surrounding the 4 in the center refuted that idea. Not to mention, the Triforce had an empty spot in the center, not another triangle filled with curious marks. Pushing his sleeve back down, Hal pressed on toward the village, hoping to find answers there. Hours had passed since he first checked his phone for a signal. He was fooled by the initial distance to the village. While it couldn't have been more than a few miles away, those miles were over tremendously hilly terrain, where a single mile of walking might only cover a quarter of that toward his destination. After descending the final hill, the village spread out ahead of him. A low stone wall served as its border, not even tall enough to stop somebody from stepping over it. People milled about in strange clothes that made Hal wonder if he had somehow stumbled upon the Ren Fair. Men walked about with swords belted to their hips and in similarly strange clothes. But rather than an air of frivolity and fun, everybody looked dirty, angry, and eager to be about on their business. So it came as a welcome surprise to Hal, checking to make sure there wasn't at least a Wi-Fi signal, when a broad, smiling man motioned him over. The man stood between two leaning buildings, more like rough shacks, away from the main dirty road thoroughfare. Once he got close enough that Hal didn't need to shout, he held up his phone and pointed to it. "No signal around here, huh?" It was a common enough icebreaker and relatively benign, so his shock was complete when the ruddy-skinned man, still smiling, reached out and grabbed his wrist. Hal was jerked off his feet with superhuman strength. The man flipped Hal over and dragged him deeper into the darkness. Stunned and dazed, Hal fought for breath that wouldn't come. He wheezed, feeling hands darting all around him, turning out pockets and rolling him over until he was face down in the dirt. Head still ringing, a flash of words appeared in his vision. A small red bar in the bottom left shrank a little, then faded away. "The broken thief uses mug. You take 2 points of damage. Your items are stolen." What the? By the time Hal gathered his wits enough to understand he was just mugged, the man was already gone. And so was the strange text that appeared. The whole affair couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. Not that he could check. His watch and his phone were gone, along with whatever else he had in his pockets. The longer he was in this strange place, the more ephemeral his thoughts felt. Like rapidly vanishing mist, he was having trouble making sense of things that should have been fairly obvious. Groggy and still reeling from what happened, Hal got to his feet with the aid of the nearby splintery wall. People walked by. A few glanced his way but were quick to mind their own business. Did nobody care he was just mugged? A fire lit in his belly, and, bruised as he was, he rushed out from the shadows of the two buildings and onto the dirt road in pursuit of his mugger. It should have taken him seconds to realize he wouldn't find him with all the foot traffic. Instead, he spent several fruitless minutes searching until he understood the futility of it. Why couldn't he think clearly? With no money, no ID, and no means of getting home, his only hope rested with a police officer or a sheriff of some kind. If this was a Ren Fair, they would have one, wouldn't they? In the back of his mind, he knew something was wrong. With himself, with this place. There were too many crazy things that had happened to him to refute. And so, like the rest of the well-to-do Williams family, he blocked it out and shoved it into a dark corner of his mind. Once he was safe, alone, and had plenty to drink, then he could try to face it. But not until then. That was the Williamses' way, after all. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a mop of greasy black hair stood watching the crowd of people go about their business. A guard, he guessed, judging by the stained dark blue uniform he wore. This part of the village looked better than the rest, with dirty, pitted cobbles that shifted underfoot and buildings with signs on them. It was a definite step up from muddy streets. Samaic font, to the point he couldn't even read it. But the images that were carved and painted alongside the words served well enough. There was a tavern, an inn, some kind of general store he guessed to be the gift shop, and another shop he couldn't identify. Hal approached the guard. The man's deep blue tunic sported tarnished brass buttons that had clearly seen better days. The sword he had belted on his hip looked old and dirty, with several deep nicks. No smile from this man, no form of greeting. Hal cleared his dry throat, remembering suddenly that he had been walking for a couple of hours without food or water. Hiking a thumb back the way he came, Hal meant to say, "I was just mugged over there. He stole my phone and my wallet." Instead, what actually came out of his mouth was, "Dirty man do bad thing." What? That is not what I said. He cleared his throat once more and tried again. Except this time his voice jumped several octaves until his words came out as a shrill, "Very bad man took precious!" Hal just stared blankly at the man, hoping he was having a stroke and would just die already. The man looked down his long, many-broken nose and squinted at Hal. He spoke in a strange language he never heard of. It sounded like a cross between French and Arabic. Hal shook his head and spread his arms out wide, trying to mime that he didn't understand him, which meant he immediately started doing the chicken dance, tucking his hands under his arms and flapping them like little wings. What the flork is wrong with me? Wait, what? I didn't say flork. I said flork. Oh, come on. I can't curse? Florking wonderful. The guard reacted to the display with immediate prejudice. Hal could hardly blame him. Before Hal even noticed the movement, the guard grabbed his left arm and squeezed painfully hard on his wrist, as if feeling for a hidden dagger. Confusion passed over the man's face. He gave a casual yank on Hal's left sleeve. The hearty flannel ripped as easily as tissue paper. And out from that rip came a faint golden glow. The guard's gray eyes were dazzled by the display. He gingerly parted Hal's torn sleeve to view the golden tattoo in full. His eyes went wide, and he began to gibber incoherently. The man's voice was pitched high in abject terror. A dark stain spread across the guard's pants. His lips flapped uselessly, trying to form words, but only a stream of babble came out. Hal was frozen by the display, unsure how to take the sudden turn. Their eyes met. Hal's dark brown to the man's light gray. The man shook and stepped back. His hands flew from Hal as if suddenly burned. He turned and fled, wailing and laughing in turn. Confused, tired, and afraid, Hal hurried away as fast as he could. At first he walked, but the many stares and pointing fingers of those that had witnessed the strange display followed him. He wanted to be gone from this horrible place. So he ran, and shortly put the scene and the growing crowd behind him. Hal continued to jog, wheezing the whole way as he broke into the low foothills with a thick forest of dark trees. He only stopped once he had crested the second hill. He leaned tiredly against the bark and tried in vain to catch his breath. It didn't surprise him as he looked down toward the village he had just fled from and spotted tiny flickering torchlight heading his way in the darkening afternoon. A storm rolled in soon after Hal began his continued flight into the wooded foothills of that horrible place. With no idea where he was and no help forthcoming, Hal was forced to rely on his survival skills, of which he had none. He didn't know which plant to eat, which plant would kill him, and he suspected that many of the plants were unknown to even the most esteemed botanist. The rain drove him on. It pushed at his back and soaked his clothes. His boots were the only thing that remained dry. He had bought into the whole hipster trend when he moved to Seattle, and the pair of expensive hiking boots had kept his feet dry this entire time. Every other part of him, however, was soaked to the bone. Despite the dreariness of the rainstorm, it seemed to have a stronger effect on the villagers that had decided to chase him. They never got close enough to see more than a fleeting waterlogged glimpse of their quarry, and with the rain dampening their torches, they eventually gave up. Hal kept going regardless. The trees became larger, the land more unruly, but no longer hilly. He thought he heard the sound of running water, but through the wind, rain, and darkness he couldn't locate it. He cupped his hands in a feeble attempt at catching the rain to quench his cracked lips and parched throat. His gait became leaden and clumsy. The uneven ground tripped him more often than not. Eventually, fatigue and fear claimed their due. Hal nearly collapsed when he finally found a reasonably dry section of underbrush beneath the sheltering roots of a large tree he could curl up beneath. Sleep fell upon him in an instant. His dreams were filled with more running, this time from terrible beasts, monsters that reached out and wanted nothing more than to devour him whole. When he awoke, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and in the tiny hollow he had found, he was almost warm. As consciousness returned, he nearly screamed at the dozens of insects that were crawling all over him. Hal had not slept in a warm, comfortable place, as he had first thought, but rather a nasty, dirty hole with a roof of roots and an oozy smell he couldn't clear from his nostrils. Fear lent him strength, and Hal quickly got to his feet, brushing and smacking at his arms and legs to rid himself of the crawling things. He shivered, more from the bugs than the cold, and immediately set off again. He hoped he was going in the same direction he was traveling the night before. It took him some time to find his bearings. How long, he couldn't tell. The overcast, drizzly sky gave him no clues as to the sun's position. But he did find the direction he was walking last night, and, more importantly, he found a river. Whether it was the same one he had heard on and off throughout the evening, he couldn't be sure, and he didn't care. The river leaned down into a trough and trickled over a bed of bright river stones, every color of the rainbow. It was barely 5 yards wide, and shallow enough that he could wade through it up to his hips if he so chose. Hal dunked his head into the cold waters. Refreshed, he cupped his hands and drank his fill. For once, he felt a measure of safety. There were no ominous noises, no beasts to hunt him, no monsters like in his dreams, and no insane people chasing him. The guard had, quite literally, lost his florking mind when he saw the mark on Hal's arm, and apparently, so had he. There was no explanation for his inability to speak properly, or the strange, involuntary urge to mock the man. And with his sleeve ripped, it wasn't going to be easy to hide it if he meant to venture into another village, which he knew he needed to do if only to find some dry clothes and food. He wasn't any good at foraging, and the gnawing pit in his middle demanded he eat something. Hal smeared a handful of river mud over his mark. It was thick enough to block out the glowing light, and he was filthy enough that it no longer looked out of place. It was pitiful protection against prying eyes, he knew, but he also could not think of a better solution. He knew there was one, but every time he grabbed at it, the concept vanished. He needed to find a village to get some food and warm clothes somehow, and if these people were as backwaters as they seemed, they'd have their clothes drying out on a line. And while he was trading his dirty, soggy clothes for dry ones, maybe there'd be a pie on the windowsill. Yeah, right, he thought with a snort, rising to his feet. That's about as likely as finding a door back to my apartment. If he had to survive in the wilds, he would be dead. If not by some random animal, then by eating something poisonous. And so, with a belly full of fresh water, Hal continued on. His stomach wasn't fooled, though. It soon began to grumble and groan loudly for something substantial. Halfway through that day, Hal came upon another village. This one was smaller, more like a farming community. Large fields in squarish patches ringed this side of the little village, but he saw no crops, only strange blocky impressions in the ground. This village, like the one before it, was tucked away amid sheltering hills. But the land between them was relatively flat, and the forest butted up against several homes, many of which, he saw through the gaps in the trees, did indeed have clotheslines full of garments. He had no way of knowing if the villagers here would be hostile, and after the last 2 interactions, he didn't care. He wasn't going to risk it. He was somewhere else. Somehow, some way, he was in a different land. What little instincts he possessed screamed at him that this was distinctly other. There were too many idiosyncrasies, Too many minor differences that added up to create an alien world that only looked like home on the surface. He could no longer deny that he was far from home, no matter how much he wanted to. Hal skirted the edge of the forest toward the closest homes while he waited for the light to fade to dusk. They were more rough timber one-room shacks than actual houses. It was less than 10 yards to the nearest clothesline. Flapping in the faint breeze, he saw a dark cloak, some white medieval-looking shirts, and dark pants that looked worse off than his jeans. The hills on either side of the small village cloaked the wooden shacks in gloom well before the sun fully set. Just enough light for Hal to see by. Hopefully enough to grab some clothes and maybe some food if he was lucky. 2. Under the failing light, Hal crept out of the woods. He kept as low as possible, moving between the walls of swaying laundry hanging out to dry. Every footstep felt impossibly loud as it crunched on the dry grass. So far, he only found bed linens and women's clothes. Up ahead, he saw the dark cloak he spotted from the forest and made a beeline for it. The brown cloak was in direct view of an open window, and on its sill was something that looked a lot like a pie. Hal crept closer to the cloak, but his eyes and his stomach could only focus on the food another 5 or 6 yards away. A distant, echoing boom resounded, and he found his vision drawn up and over his left shoulder to the dark, bruised sky. He managed to catch the tail end of a flash, then another series of dull explosions, like distant fireworks, and more flashes. "Isn't that out of order?" he thought, entranced by the spectacle. The lights came after the sound. It should have been reversed. The booming flashes of light came again. This time he paid closer attention. 2 booms, 3 flashes, 2 booms. A signal. It was too regular to be anything else. It repeated again a few seconds later. Hal turned his attention back to the cloak and pulled it free from the line. In the flash of the signal fireworks, Hal looked back to the pie. All thought of taking it flew from his head at the sight. A young woman stood at the window watching the sky, a heavy knife in her hand to cut the pie. In the bright, revealing light of the fireworks, she saw Hal. Her expression sprang from one emotion to the next. Worry, confusion, then anger when she realized Hal was stealing, and finally, wide-eyed horror when she caught sight of his forearm. And the glowing golden light that stood out in stark contrast to the gloom that fell between each flash of the night sky. In the hours since Hal covered it in mud, the masking stuff had dried and cracked apart. When he went to pull the cloak down, the gold light of the mark shone clear through the dried dirt. He didn't wait for the woman to recover her wits. Hal turned and fled back toward the forest. All thought of getting any food or more clothes abandoned. Glancing over his shoulder, Hal saw the woman cock back her arm. He was already halfway to the forest. There was no way she could hit him from that distance. The woman didn't seem to agree. Hal watched in horror as the knife flipped end over end toward him. Its graceful arc put it on a collision course with the flapping blankets of laundry. At the last second, the wind shifted like some cruel joke. The knife that should have gotten tangled up in the sheets sailed clear over the dozens of yards right for Hal's back. Hal dropped to the dirt as fast as he could. The blade sliced through the air where he was standing, a heartbeat before. It made a dull thump somewhere in the tree line. The distance worked in his favor. It gave him time to react, no matter how impossible the woman's throw was. The uses knife toss. The attack misses. He scrambled to his feet, the flash of text vanishing before he could focus on it. Hal tried to find the knife, but gave up when he didn't see it after a few seconds of searching. He didn't have the time. The small village came alive with the sound of shouts,
and a chillingly discordant horn that sounded throughout every home. Any guilt he had about stealing the cloak vanished. What's petty theft matter if they already wanted to hurt me or kill me? Once he was beneath the thick boughs of the forest, Hal took a moment to don the cloak. It was rougher than anything he'd ever felt, but he immediately felt warmer. It struck him as odd that the effect was so complete and stark. Body heat simply did not work like that. It was almost like magic, came the unbidden thought, and he pushed it roughly away.
But it came back with a vengeance as he made his way deeper into the woods, with no course in mind beyond putting as much distance between him and that last village. If there was magic, and he was marked, shouldn't he have some way of defending himself? He was as weak as a toddler compared to everyone else. Rather than feeling like he was in an epic movie, he felt scared and alone. Night came swiftly in the covered forest. A steady downpour tried to drown him. Thankfully, the cloak held up. His feet ached, and he was covered in at least 24 bleeding scratches and bruises from slips, falls, and stray branches. No movie, video game, or book ever prepared him for how impossibly dark it gets when there are no street lights, no moon, and no stars. In the depths of the forest, it went beyond simple darkness to an abyssal ink. He couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. Fear was the only thing keeping him going, yet the worry of stumbling into a dry gully and snapping his leg, or worse, finally forced him to stop. He hadn't heard any signs of pursuit for at least an hour. With the cloak about him, he was reasonably dry, and it was large enough that he could prop up against one of the massive tree trunks and tuck up beneath the brown material. His second night was less miserable than the first. Though he had nothing to eat for 2 days and little to drink, he was dry and relatively warm. Blissful, dreamless sleep claimed him that night, and the following morning he awoke to the distant baying of hounds. It would seem they were going to give up after all. In his groggy, half-asleep state, Hal thought it was another nightmare, and he tried to go back to sleep. But when the baying came again, this time even closer, he recognized the danger he was in. His eyes shot open with the burst of fear-laden adrenaline. Rather than leaping to his feet and continuing his panicked flight from the day before, Hal stared down 3 feet of gleaming steel pointed at his face. Trailing his gaze down the subtle curve of the blade to the young woman that held it, Hal wondered just how he could get away. A quick glance as the woman's piercing blue-gray eyes told him she wasn't about to fall for any tricks. He kicked himself for ignoring the earlier warning, but he had been so exhausted. Nobody expects to randomly find themselves alone in a savage world. Not any normal modern-day adult. This was his 3rd day without food, and the constant exertion was taking a heavy toll on his unfit body. Being tired, afraid, with a dozen aches in places he didn't know he could ache in, not to mention starving and severely dehydrated, played a massive impact on his ability to think clearly and muster any strength to keep going. The woman was still holding the blade, its tip a clear threat, but she made no move to use it. She eyed him with those sharp, intelligent eyes that took in the filthy, disheveled, mud-caked man before her. As she looked over him, her eyes inevitably fell to his left arm. The cloak's rough-spun fibers let out just enough light from the mark to draw attention to it. Under the shade of the forest canopy, it was fairly conspicuous. She barked a command in a foreign language, melodic and lilting. Even her rough tone could do nothing to strip the music from her words. Seeing his obvious confusion, she spoke again in a different language. Every syllable was filled with a guttural sound. Seeing the lack of Hal's comprehension, she spoke in a 3rd language, this time in clipped sentences. Of all the languages, the last one sounded closest to English. The utterly foreign words, however, made it impossible for him to grasp what she was trying to get across. Hal spread his arms out wide, shrugged his shoulders, and shook his head. "What say?" He cringed. The way her face screwed up at his idiotic foreign words told him enough. Though if she did speak his language, he imagined her reaction would be no different. There would be no overcoming this language barrier. He had to admit this was about as good as he probably could expect. She wasn't hurting him or locking him up, nor had she run away in fear. Attempting to communicate was never a bad sign. Eventually, like every other person, she focused on his mark. Hal watched her inch the blade toward his left arm. He kept very still indeed, aware that the slightest twitch might set the girl off. Sharp eyes flicked toward Hal as she fell into an easy, and impossibly deep to Hal's limited mobility, squat, and moved toward his outstretched arm. She paused halfway there to regard his brown eyes. "Hell yeah," she breathed in awe. "Hair gel?" Hal asked. The girl looked at him, and with her free hand pointed to her eyes with her index and middle finger. She pointed to the dirt, then to Hal. The closest Hal could get out of the miming was that he had dirty eyes? Rude. "Brown," answered his awakening brain. "Helye means brown eyes? Why would that matter?" While Hal wasn't the most observant at all times, especially not in his present state, but looking back, he couldn't recall a single dark-eyed person in either village. Every other human he'd seen, including the one in front of him, possessed bright and colorful eyes. He even recalled a few with impossible colors like lavender and rose. Bent over his arm, her free hand pulled up the rough cloth of the brown cloak, and her reaction was the same as every other. The gold light from the mark dazzled her eyes, and she stared with great awe at it. If he had any hope of escaping, now would be it, while she was distracted. Hal tensed, readying himself to slip out of her grip and spring away as fast as he could. He certainly wasn't going to wait around for her to skewer him with that sword, or worse, wait until those baying hounds found him. The slight twitch of his muscles alerted the girl, and she tightened her grip. It wasn't painful, but it might as well have been an iron manacle about his wrist. At the same time, she angled her blade toward his heart, resting the flat of it on her raised forearm. All it would take was a casual lean from his captor, a few inches, to kill him. Embarrassed at being so thoroughly foiled before he ever got the chance, Hal relaxed and leaned sullenly against the tree at his back. With a nod that told him she expected no less of a sensible reaction, the woman withdrew the threatening blade. Even without it aimed at him, Hal was certain she could cut him down before he rose to his feet. Hal watched her as she became enamored with the mark once more. The light seemed to fill her bright, wide eyes. She looked around the same age at him, mid-20s, but that was where the similarity stopped. She wore an outfit that, at first glance, looked like 1,000 leaves sewn together, but upon further inspection, he found they were cunningly worked leather plates. They overlapped and were perfectly colored to give the appearance of individual leaves. Most of her skin was covered except for the fingertips at the end of her gloves and her face. She had a slightly plump, cherubic face with golden blonde hair. A single red thread was wound throughout a thickly plaited cord of golden hair that ran down the side of her face. She was beautiful. Shorter than Hal, but lean and strong, like a gymnast, readily evident even under the camouflaging armor she wore. She caught Hal staring at her, and her lightly tanned skin flushed. From the way her blue-gray eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, he knew that was no blush of embarrassment. It was anger.
He did his best to paint an innocent look on his face and smile, but it didn't lessen her scowl.
She jerked his arm and pointed at the dirtied mark, caked with dried blood and mud, while she let loose another stream of urgent-sounding words. All Hal could do was shake his head. "Me no know what do. Bright color, why?" He jabbed a finger at the golden mark, suddenly angry. Doubly so, because the words that came out of his mouth weren't the ones he intended to say. He wanted to tell her that he didn't know why he had the mark, much less what it was. Not that she would have understood him anyway. None of this was fair. He wanted to be back in his apartment, ordering so much takeout from the local Chinese restaurant that he was on a first basis with the delivery guy. The huntress, as Hal was beginning to think of her, took out a cloth and a canteen. She poured the water out onto the dark cloth, and Hal's eyes went wide with thirst. He licked his dry, chapped lips. That look had not escaped her notice, and, in an act of kindness, she handed him the leather-wrapped canteen. While Hal hungrily drank from the relatively small canteen, the huntress scrubbed the blood and mud from his mark. If she thought the mark would be wiped away, she was sorely mistaken. Hal watched out of one eye as he forced himself to slow down and sip the water, knowing the dangers of drinking too much too fast. The mark shone even brighter than before. Its many intricate lines were as clear as the day he first arrived. The baying of the hounds echoed all about them, and the sound of distant voices filtered in through the trees. There was a strangeness to the forest, the way it warped and twisted sound. Hal stopped drinking from the canteen that seemed to hold a suspiciously large quantity of water to better listen. They were close now. He watched the huntress for any sign of what she would do. He was at her mercy, and under no illusion that she was going to let him go.
Would she kill him, or hand him over to his pursuers? It would be nice to know why they were chasing him. It wasn't like he hurt anybody or did anything bad. The theft of a single cloak surely didn't warrant such an aggressive response. Without any preamble, the huntress released his arm and stood. In one smooth motion, she sheathed her sword and offered a gloved hand to Hal. He grabbed it, and she effortlessly hauled him to his feet. The huntress put a finger to her pursed lips. Hal nodded his understanding. She pulled a bow off her back and fit an arrow to the string. Keeping low, she guided Hal around the tree he slept beneath and up a nearby slope. He did the best he could to keep up and stay silent, but he was noisy and slow. His stomach twisted in a tightening knot of pain. Every few feet, the huntress stopped and waited for Hal. The forest changed around them. Thick trunks gave way to smaller ones, with larger gaps in the canopy overhead, letting in streams of gray morning light. The storm, it seemed, had spent most of its fury last night and was content to leave the sky overcast. Thick underbrush grew up between the thinning trees. The huntress led him through, pulling branches and bushes aside to aid in his passage. Every so often, Hal took another drink from the canteen. By his estimation, he drank enough refreshingly cold spring water to fill the oblong container several times over. No matter how long he drank, the canteen never emptied. Before Hal had time to ponder the implications, or the impossibility of the canteen, the huntress grabbed him and pulled him roughly to the ground. He would have fallen face first if she hadn't put out another hand to catch him inches from the dirt. The huntress guided him deeper into the thick underbrush until they were both well hidden. Like every other person he came across, the huntress was ridiculously strong and had no problem moving him about like he was a doll. Conversely, Hal was weaker than he ever had been in his life, and he didn't chalk that just up to exhaustion, starvation, and dehydration. It was something more than that, just like his inability to speak with any semblance of intelligence. Through the bushes, he couldn't see much, but the huntress could. She had her sword out and murder in her eyes. And while the villagers didn't seem to harbor any good intentions toward him, he didn't know if they deserved to die. For all he knew, the mark meant he was some virulent plague bringer. If only he could speak their language, understand what they were saying. Better yet, if he could speak their language and didn't sound like an idiot. It hit him how important communication was. Discerning friend from foe was so much easier when intentions were obvious. The whole ordeal could be a misunderstanding, not that Hal was willing to risk himself on that theory. While Hal couldn't see the villagers, he could hear their many feet stomping around. They spoke in that same harsh, guttural language the huntress tried to speak to him in. Next to him, the huntress tensed like some great hunting cat. Her eyes focused on the scene before her. Hal held his breath as the tension drew itself out to the breaking point. Just as he wondered when she was going to spring out in a blur of violence and kill every man and woman there, the huntress relaxed. The voices grew distant, and a dozen shaky breaths later, she pulled him out of the bush and took off, strangely, in the direction the group had come from. They had many more run-ins with the villagers. The baying of the dogs was background noise to their constant traveling. The huntress pulled Hal along the entire way, never threatening, but always insistent. Hal didn't know if she would stop him from leaving, but he had no intention of fleeing. She was the only person that had helped him so far, and he imagined he would be caught within minutes of being on his own. The wily woman led them in strange, circuitous patterns that at times came uncomfortably close to his pursuers, and at others seemed to place them far behind. Hal could make no sense of the direction, and eventually gave up trying. Instead, he focused on the huntress and doing his best to follow her. Sometime around midday, she held up a hand, and Hal froze mid-stride. She cocked her head to the side. They hadn't heard a villager or much of anything for the last hour, and rather than constantly changing their path, they were making a steady progression in a single direction. He put a hand out to brace himself against the nearby tree. He was out of breath again. Through the bark, he felt a faint tremor. Hal looked to the huntress, and their eyes met. He saw her worry and concern. And a moment later, coming down from the high branches of the tree he was leaning against, he saw the reason. It reared up ahead of them, the strangest creature Hal had ever seen. It stood well over 10 feet tall, covered in a mixture of chitinous green plates and coarse black fur caked with green moss. Thick, trunk-like legs supported a wide, fur-covered torso with an insectile head and long, serrated arms like a praying mantis. It clicked its 2-foot-long mandibles at them, bulbous eyes regarding them as little more than snacks. The huntress moved into swift action. She unslung her bow and had 3 arrows leaping into the air before Hal could even take his hand away from the tree. Hal looked around on the ground, found a rock, and hefted it in his palms. As much as he wanted to run and hide, he could at least prove a decent distraction. The arrows struck deep into the thick fur, and the creature loosed a disorienting wail. The huntress staggered for a brief moment. The Yuze's stunning wail. You resist the effect. Somehow, unaffected, Hal hurled the stone as hard as he could. In a feat of atypical strength, he managed a decent throw. The rough stone tumbled end over end and struck the thing on its bulbous compound eye, just as it leaned down to strike at the huntress. You throw a rock at the scourge? The scourge takes 3 points of damage. Am I in a game? That was the only time he had ever seen prompts like that before. He forced the thoughts away. He couldn't afford to be distracted at a time like this. That was all the huntress needed. The creature swiveled its head to regard the annoyance. How? With its deadly arms slowed by the distraction, the huntress jumped over the scything blades.
She cleared 6 feet into the air like it was nothing. The monster lifted one serrated claw and struck out at the easier target. Its arm came down at an angle that would cleave Hal from shoulder to hip. He tried to dive to the side, but already knew he would be too slow. But the huntress wasn't. She pulled back on her bow and let fly a glowing arrow that cut a streak of red lightning through the air before her feet even touched the ground. The arrow intercepted the claw and exploded. Waves of heat washed over Hal's face and rolled over his back. But the arrow had done its job, and when the smoke cleared, the claw's reach had been reduced to 8 feet. The broken 4-foot tip of the claw laid near Hal on the ground, leaking an Icarus briny fluid. Feeling somewhat useful, Hal pushed himself up to his knees and looked for another rock. If he could distract the monster again, the huntress could capitalize on it. What he found instead was a wriggling length of rope he initially mistook for a snake. He leaped to his feet away from it at first, only to trip and fall. The rope lashed out like a striking viper and coiled itself around Hal's ankles before he could even shout. A second rope soared out from the side and perfectly encircled his wrists. In less time than it took him to say, "What do I?" Hal was tied up and lifted off his feet by the magical rope.
The huntress uses binding rope. You suffer the effect of bind. There was that prompt again. The huntress moved one hand through the air like she was conducting a symphony. Her fingers left trailing lines of light in the chill air. In response, the ropes tugged harder and pulled Hal behind a row of sheltering trees. He tried in vain to wriggle out of the bonds, but they held tight. In one move, the huntress had removed him from the fight. Hal could still hear the sounds of battle, but could no longer see anything, and it seemed like it was getting fainter. His embarrassment and frustration soon gave way to amazement. He was floating in the air, suspended by magical ropes. His mind spun with the implications. Judging from the way she had cast the spell, or so he assumed, it was an easy thing, as she did it mid-combat. Not to mention the game-like prompts. Just where was he? Hal stopped struggling and examined them closer. They seemed like any normal rope, except faint silvery threads were wound throughout the weave. They glinted every so often in the wan light. A chilling screech echoed through the forest, followed immediately by a heavy thump he heard but could not feel. The ropes lowered until his feet touched the ground a moment later. They slithered from him and went around the side of the tree to join the huntress. She knelt down and opened one of the many small pouches she carried, far too small for so much rope, and the 2 ropes obediently slithered up her thigh into the pouch. In the distance behind her, Hal could just make out the charred and arrow-riddled remains of the monster. She cast him an appraising, vaguely angry look, one that immediately turned to surprise as a golden wind surrounded Hal and flowed through him. His mind felt clearer than it had in years. His body felt like he just spent a full day at an expensive spa. His muscles were relaxed, and that ache in his back that had been bothering him for months was just gone. The huntress defeats the scourge. You gain 200 experience points, minus 80% from contribution. Novice reaches level 1. You have 5 unspent attribute points awaiting distribution. Your HP, SP, and MP are fully restored. And how do I do that? Hal started to say something when she raised a hand to forestall him. Without a word, she moved past him and continued on ahead. He had plenty to think about as he followed in the wake of the huntress. Focusing on the prompt that remained in his vision, for once brought up a simple menu. By selecting status in a similar way, a semi-translucent window of information floated in front of his face, about an arm's length away. Hal Williams, Level 1. Next level, 100 over 350. Classes, Novice, 1. Resources. Health points, HP, 20/20. Stamina points, SP, 20/20. Mana points, MP, 20/20. Attributes. Strength, Strr, 1+. Vitality, Vit, 1+. Dexterity, 1+. Agility, 1+. Intelligence, 1+. Mind, 1+. Charisma, 1+. Regeneration. HP per hour, 6.5. SP per hour, 6.8. MP per hour, 6.8. Resistances. Fire, 0. Ice, 0. Wind, 0. Earth, 0. Lightning, 0. Water, 0. Light, 0. Dark, 0. Defensive parameters. Defense, 0. Magic defense, 0. Insulation, 4. Class affinity. Survival skills. Combat skills. Magic skills. Crafting skills. Social skills. Hal rubbed his temples tiredly, trying to keep everything in sight while not tripping or falling over any of the roots or stones. The prompt said he had 5 points to spend, right? Focusing on one of the plus icons next to a stat, Hal mentally poked at it. The number went up by 1. His Strr doubled to 2, and suddenly his skinny, stick-like arms bulked up and gained muscular definition. Not enough to be considered healthy, even, but more than he presently had, though he was never so emaciated back in Seattle, or ever in his life. Okay, I get it. As soon as he placed a point, another icon appeared to subtract it. He took away the point in STR. Immediately a wave of nausea assaulted him, and it was an effort just to keep moving. He staggered more than once, but managed to stay upright. If these stats, all ones, he noted sourly, were really the representation of himself in this world, then a lot of things made sense, chiefly his demonstrably low INT. First things first. I cannot continue to talk like a florking idiot. And if it really is this easy to increase my intelligence, maybe I can learn the language easier if I upgrade it. Hal placed 4 points into INT. Immediately, his sluggish, hazy thoughts became crystal clear. Time for the true test. Hal cleared his throat and said, "Listen, I know we got off on the wrong foot, but something was wrong with my brain before. Thank you for helping me." Relief washed over him as his mouth didn't ad-lib or go full catatonic on him. The huntress looked over her shoulder at him, but didn't reply. "Right," Hal muttered. "The language thing." Still, it was a welcome change that he could speak properly now. Hal confirmed the stat placement and looked at the single point left over, placing it into STR. His arms bulked a little again, and it was easier to hold his head upright and walk properly. He took another look at just the core stats to see if anything else changed, such as his regeneration. Hal Williams, level 1. Next level, 100/350. Classes, novice, 1. Resources, health points, HP, 20/20. Stamina points, SP, 20/20. Mana points, MP, 20/20. Attributes, strength, STR, 2. Vitality, VIT, 1. Dexterity, DEX, 1. Agility, AGI, 1. Intelligence, INT, 5. Mind, MND,
1. Charisma, CHR, 1. Regeneration, HP per hour, 6.5. SP per hour, 6.8. MP per hour, 6.8. Fair enough, he thought. INT and STR don't seem to affect regeneration rates.
After seeing how poorly having a 1 for a stat was, Hal's first priority became getting every stat to a passable level. Seeing as having 5 INT seemed to be at least equivalent to his usual level of intelligence, as far as he could tell, that would be the benchmark he would set for the rest of his stats. The untiring woman walked on, and though Hal tried to sate his hunger with more pristine mountain water from the magically infinite canteen, his stomach was not buying it. It growled, continually and loudly, enough that the huntress finally looked back at him as if he was doing it intentionally. He gave her an apologetic shrug. She took the canteen and took a sip before giving it back, spoke to him again in a melodic voice before giving up and miming. She rubbed her stomach, the leaf-molded plates of leather shifting with her touch.
I guess some things are universal, Hal said, nodding along. Yes, I am starving.
Hal thought he remembered reading somewhere that a person could last over a week without food. He was fast coming up on only half that, and he felt like death warmed over. The huntress nodded and took him over a nearby rise. Down in a small grassy depression, pockmarked with muddy pools from the recent rains, Hal saw the strangest tree he'd ever seen. It towered above the rest, but it wasn't the tree that drew his eye. It was the 1,000 different shades of virulently colored mushrooms that grew from the trunk. Many of them were large enough to sit on like something out of Alice in Wonderland. The huntress was already halfway to the tree by the time Hal realized he had stopped walking to marvel at the tower of fungus. Weakened from hunger and the constant marching, Hal did his best to catch up, but it was a poor attempt, even with his extra point in STR. Now that the burst of adrenaline from the level up had worn off, he was more sluggish than ever. By the time he reached the tree of 1,000,000 fungi, the huntress was hard at work examining the colorful things. Mushrooms had never been his favorite, but he was so hungry he would have eaten almost anything placed in front of him. The huntress stopped him at a pace or two from the tree and grabbed his shoulder. Hal looked questioningly at her. It was obvious she was trying to find a way to tell him something without using words. Finally, she nodded and held up a finger. Releasing her grip on his shoulder, she pointed at him, then mimed covering her eyes with one hand. Her free hand reached out toward the tree, and she pretended to take something from it. Without looking at it or removing her hand from her eyes, she mimed shoving it into her mouth and eating. "I got it," Hal said with a nod. "You want me to shut my eyes and pick a mushroom at random and eat it without looking?" The huntress smiled encouragingly, the first smile he'd ever seen on her typically dour features. She took the canteen from him and stepped aside. Normally, Hal would have been skeptical, or even feared that this was some horrendously elaborate prank, but he knew it didn't hold any merit. If the woman wanted to poison or kill him, she had more direct methods. And besides, Hal had let his whole life pass him by as he weighed the pros and cons of every situation in his life. He was tired of overanalyzing and coming up with plans for events that would never occur. He wanted to live. I don't want to be the same person. Not here. If magic can exist, then that means I don't need to be the same version of me that I've always been. Hal took the remaining steps to the tree and reached out with his free hand, eyes squeezed shut. Blindly, he grabbed a spongy top and ripped off a chunk. Without daring to open his eyes, afraid he'd chicken out at the last second, he took a bite.
His teeth crunched through the skin and into the dry, spongy material below.
It tasted about as bad as he expected, like old gym socks or really expensive cheese. He never could tell the difference. Forcing down every bite, Hal ate the mushroom. Hal opened his eyes to the worst acid trip in his life. Colors swirled and melted together, then reformed entirely new, never-seen-before hues. The huntress stood before him, but her eyes were swimming around her face, and her mouth rippled and undulated like noodles in a bowl of soup. The deep pit in his stomach was gone. Though he felt more than a little queasy, he also was strangely sated, as if he had eaten a large 4-course meal. The huntress reached out and steadied him before he realized he was about to fall. Everything spun and twisted around as the hallucination took hold. I just ate a mushroom. What did I expect? He tried to talk, but his words came out slurred and strange. The huntress replied to him, but he continued not understanding a single word. As she laid him down onto the grass, another window appeared. You eat the allspeak fungus. Language unlocked. Common. You are poisoned. You are paralyzed. Oh, good. Darkness closed in around him, and he heard the huntress's soft, lamenting voice. Ore. Her eyes found his, the only bright things in the darkness around. Hlar Messifa, can you hear me? What is wrong? Hal tried to answer, but found he no longer had control over his tongue. The last thing he remembered was the huntress bending down to lift him into her arms as the darkness finally closed in around him.